Welcome to Kedem. I am very glad to host today Professor Joshua Berman from Bar-Ilan University. And we are going to talk about the book you published, Created Equal, by the Oxford Press. Professor, it's almost like a common knowledge that the birthplace, the cradle of the democracy, is the Greece. But in fact, in your book, you are taking a different approach, and you claim that the Bible, the place where the democracy started.
Right, yes. We are accustomed to thinking of our Bibles as religious documents. They tell us about how we are to relate to God. But in fact, in the ancient times, there was no such thing as just religion, me and God. How people related to gods was bound up with how they related to all aspects of society. And so when the Pentateuch, what we call here the Torah, came to discuss Israel's relationship with the Almighty, it had to discuss all facets of social life. And therefore what we find in the 5 books of Moses is nothing less than the birthplace of the idea of equality. It is a political document no less than it is a religious document. Let me explain what I mean by that, because that's not an intuitive move for us to understand. As you pointed out, we normally think of Athens, of ancient Greece, as the birthplace of democracy. And there is some truth to that, in that the top 10% of people living in Athens in classical times had democracy. But the other 90% beneath them were serfs and slaves and did not enjoy from democracy at all. If we want to find the very first place in history where we find a blueprint, a document that puts out the idea that we should detract, water down, weaken hierarchy and stratification, and put a newfound emphasis on the common man, on the people, that is not in Athens. That is in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses.
If I am talking about one of our greatest myths of Jewish people, the Exodus. Exodus is a very strange story. Actually, it's claiming that we all come from slavery, and we all as a nation, without any exception, there is no special group. We all used to be slaves in Egypt.
Right. So what we can see actually is that the way in which the Torah promulgates what I am claiming is this thesis of let's water down hierarchy and stratification. It encompasses many different aspects. The first and maybe the most important one is the theological one. The story of the Exodus has a political aspect to it, in that it basically states all Israelites start from the same lowly place. We were all slaves. Therefore that means no one in Israel can ever claim, oh, I should be the king because I am from a chosen or special family. At least initially. Later in the book of Samuel, of course, we have the choosing of the house of David. But in the time of the Torah, we don't have this yet. You mentioned the Exodus, but we can also see a political aspect to the revelation at Sinai. The very idea that the Almighty would reveal himself to an entire people and talk to them and give them laws about their lives. This was unprecedented anywhere else. In all the other cultures, to the degree that there is prophecy, it's always between God and the king. The gods never had any interest in the common people. And so we can see that the 2 founding events of the Pentateuch, the Exodus and the revelation at Sinai, already make much more level playing field. We're all originating as slaves, and that God talks to the entire people, to each person, and nothing special with regard to the kings.
In the ancient world, the rulers, the kings, they're kind of sacred persons. For example, if we are going back to Egypt, the pharaoh of Egypt was responsible for the order, mighty order between the gods and the earth, the people. And his existence was allowing actually all the system to function. So the absence of a pharaoh could bring to chaos.
I would say even before we get to the descriptions of the kings in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings, when we look at how the Torah, especially the book of Deuteronomy, relates to king and to kingship, it's light years away from anything that was known at the time. What we see, as you pointed out, Alex, elsewhere, especially in Egypt, the king was everything. I mean, the Egyptian temples, all the pictures that you see around are of the kings fighting wars on behalf of the gods, the kings offering sacrifices to the gods. When we come to the Torah, all of the hallmarks of what made a king in the ancient world are peeled away one at a time. Kings elsewhere were mighty warriors. Well, the Torah says that Israel can only ask for a king after it already enters into the land, after the conquest of the land. We don't want the king to be the conqueror of Israel and therefore the father of the nation. Elsewhere, the kings, as I pointed out, were the center of the cult and the temples. And in Egypt especially, as I pointed out, all of the decorations are all about the king. Well, in the Torah, the king has no role in the cult. Elsewhere, as we all know, famously in the Code of Hammurabi, Hammurabi says, "The gods gave me wisdom and told me to write laws for the people." Well, in the Torah, the king writes no laws at all. He has the laws read to him. He has to write down the laws of the Torah and constantly recite them. He is subject to the law. That didn't exist anywhere else. In the Torah, we have limitations for the king. Elsewhere, the kings are never subject to the law. In the book of Deuteronomy, the king can't have excessive number of horses, excessive number of wives, excessive amounts of gold and silver. The idea that there are limitations on the kingship doesn't exist anywhere else at all. One of the really fascinating things that I find about how the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy specifically, relates to political power, we can understand with regard, by using an illustration, what we know about, let's say, the British Parliament. We all know about the British Parliament that it has two houses. There's a House of Lords and a House of Commoners. Think about that. That is not quite the same as what we have in the US, a Senate and a House of Representatives. Oh, there are two chambers to the Parliament, but what is this business of lords and commoners? The idea behind that, when they came up with this system, I think in the 15th century, was the following. They said, well, we have this pre-existing hierarchy within our culture. We have lords and we have commoners. And if we want to give legislative power to balance out the king, if we give the power to the lords, then they're just going to enslave all the masses. And if we give the legislative power to the commoners, then they're just going to overrun the feudal manors and steal all the money from the lords. So why don't we, since we already have these two groups, we'll give a little bit of power to each, and they'll balance each other out, and that's how everything will work. That illustration is extremely important, because what we see there is an example which is totally foreign, certainly for in American eyes, of political office already, from the get-go, is already allocated to a specific caste, a specific social group, a specific family. This is actually the way that things were throughout the world, going back to Rome and even Greece. All political offices were always, by definition, open only to a certain caste, a certain family, a certain social group. The idea that we should have political office that is, in theory, open to anyone, that anyone could theoretically be eligible, that idea really only begins in the American Constitution, and not even the Senate originally, but there is one precedent in world history for taking political office and saying it's open to everybody. And that precedent, before, again, the American Constitution, you have to go back to the Torah, to the book of Deuteronomy. Because the book of Deuteronomy says, from among your brethren, you shall choose a king. Again, this is before we come to the election of the Davidic line in the book of Samuel. But according to Deuteronomy, in theory, it seems like anybody could, in theory, be king. Or, to be perhaps more exact, any man. But any man is still quite a lot, okay? There's no one who it's automatically given to in the first place. That's a remarkable, remarkable revolution in thinking about political office.
Professor, on one hand, indeed, the Torah states that all people of Israel are equal, they all come from slaves. but still we have some group of people, priesthood, priests, and for example, I cannot become a priest.
Right, okay, correct, yes. So here we see a good example of how the Torah begins to water down hierarchy, but not do away with it entirely. The priesthood is a perfect example. To understand what the Torah does to priesthood, let's again compare to what was going on throughout the ancient Near East. If you were a young man and you said, you know, when I grow up, I want to be a priest, and I would like to survey what priests get, what's the package you get if you work as a priest in all the different cultures. The last place that you would want to be a priest is in Israel according to the laws of the Torah. Because elsewhere, the priests were working in temples where the vast majority of the economic output was flowing into those temples. And so they were like mega banks, and the priests were mega rich. Along comes the Torah and says, we need to have officiants who work in the cult, who work in the temple. But unlike everyone else in Israel who is going to get a plot of land, the priests are not going to get a plot of land. Moreover, all of those sacrifices that are written in the book of Leviticus, and I think a lot of us, you know, when we get up to our lectoral readings and it comes to Leviticus, we're like, oh boy, it's going to be kind of dry. Like, what is important about reading about all these sacrifices? One of the things is that what Leviticus is saying is, these are the very few sacrifices that Israelites have to bring and no more. It's very important because everywhere else, the amounts of sacrifices were massive. I mean, by exponential figures relative to what we have inside the Torah. And so if ever a priest were to say to an Israelite, you want to get close to God? Well, you have to bring me more sacrifices. The Israelite can point to the texts in Leviticus and say, where does it say that? God told us what we have to bring, and it's a much smaller amount. And so here we can see how the economic clout that priests had everywhere else is now drained out of the priesthood according to the Torah. I think another place where we have a real revolution in terms of political office has to do with the judiciary. Okay? Who should appoint judges? It's even a question that we wrestle with today. How should judges be appointed? Montesquieu, in the 15th century, I think, or the 16th century, famously said, it is vital that judges be appointed by the people, because the judiciary has the unique capacity to put its hand in our pocket and take out fines, to take our body and throw it into a prison. In order for people to have faith in the judicial system, it is vital that the people themselves chose the judges. That idea has only one precursor in all of history, and that is Deuteronomy, where it says, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha, you shall appoint for yourself judges and magistrates. So again, the people are being empowered. The people are empowered to choose the king. The people are empowered to choose their judges. Any of the people, in theory, could become the king if they're so chosen.
Professor, in your book, you actually claim that the equality is expressed not only on the laws of the state or the ruling dynasty or the government, but in fact, it's also find its expression in the day-to-day life of simple people. What could you tell about that?
Right. So what we really see is that the revolution in the Torah's political thought is matched by a revolution in economic thought. The Torah has a very detailed economic plan. Now, for those that are familiar with the Pentateuch, they might be thinking, what chapter, what book was that? I don't remember, the Torah's economic platform. So let me explain what I'm talking about and where we can find it. To understand the Torah's revolutionary economic thought, we need to understand a little bit about how ancient economies worked, or maybe more accurately, how they didn't work. When times were bad, let's think about the story we're all familiar with, Joseph in Egypt. There's a famine. What happens when there's a famine in Egypt? What do the Egyptian people do? Well, they begin to sell things. First they sell their jewelry, then they'll sell their animals, then they'll sell their property. That's already very bad. If you have sold your property and you have sold the draft animals that you use to work the land, now you have nothing left with which to make a living. And if there's still going to be famine, then you're going to sell your clothes, and you're going to sell your children, and eventually you will sell yourself. And what we see here in this story of Joseph actually was a story that repeated itself over and over across the entire ancient world that we know. That when times were good and stable, the simple person went out and worked the field, usually as a sharecropper, and put some cucumbers on the table or bartered for some things, and he managed to feed his family. But when times were down, when there would be a war, when there would be a famine, a drought, a plague, as we find there in the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, what would happen is that all of the economic resources would wind up floating to the top as people sold and sold so they could get some food, and all of the people would sink down to the bottom. And this played itself out all over the ancient world. And what the Torah is aware of that. It actually discusses this phenomenon. The Old Testament does in several places. It's in Genesis 47, and it's in Jeremiah 34, and it's in Nehemiah chapter 5, for those that are familiar with those books. But what the Torah wants to do is to create an economic safety net that kind of puts in brakes to help the free fall of people when times are bad. And let me demonstrate how we can see through the Torah's various economic laws the creation of an economic safety net in this way. Because people back then, unlike us today, they didn't have Social Security, they didn't have savings, they didn't even have refrigerators and freezers. You know, we have food, we don't eat it now, we put it in the freezer, we can have it later, but there's no refrigerators, there's no freezers, there's no Social Security, there's no insurance. If you don't have food today, then you starve today. And so this was a real problem. The first and maybe most revolutionary aspect of the Torah's economic policy is what I call the Torah's jobs program. I know I sound like a presidential candidate, a jobs program. The Torah has a jobs program. Let me show you where it is. It's something we're all familiar with, but we never thought about it from an economic angle. We all know that the Torah, especially in Leviticus, states that, and in Numbers as well, that the land of Israel should be divided amongst the tribes, and within tribes, divided amongst families. Now, I suspect most people, if they were asked, who know something about the Bible, why is the land of Israel divided such? The answer would be because it's an inheritance. The land is given to the patriarchs have 12 sons, the 12 sons have descendants and more descendants and more descendants, and this is how we wind up divvying up the land, splitting it, and every family winding up with a little parcel of land. That's the nature of inheritance. You split up, you split more and more and more. That is all true, but it's not the whole truth. There's more. There is incredible economic wisdom here, because what the Torah is essentially and effectively saying is that for the first time in history, a culture will take all of its land resources, and instead of giving them straight away to the king or to the cult, we will give it to the people. There is no precedent for this. And in fact, I think in all of history, the only similar example that we can find where a government says, we have all this land, we're going to give it to the people, is in what we call in the US the Homestead Act of 1860, where following, we have to call it what it is, the genocide of the Indians, now all of the Midwest was now open for settlement. And so the government said to all these immigrants who were coming across the ocean, guys, you want to go? You want a piece of land? Go hang out in the Midwest. If you can survive the harsh winters for 3 or 4 years, you will get a parcel of land and it will be yours forever. The only precedent to that I know of is in the Torah, when it gives out land to every family in Israel. That guarantees an income. Together with that, the corollary are the laws of the Jubilee, because inevitably some people are going to have to sell their lands. Some people get sick, some people get injured, and people have to sell their resources. People go bankrupt. What the Torah says is if you have to sell your land, then at the end of 50 years, the Jubilee, you will get your land back. That gives an opportunity for the common people to get back. It's kind of like a reset of the
Economic reset.
It's an economic reset. We have another economic reset in the laws of cancellation of debt. It's very interesting here to see what the Torah does with a custom that existed really all over the ancient Near East. I mentioned before how economies didn't work so well, and when there was a drought or a famine or a war, you would have all the resources floating to the top and all of the people sinking to the bottom. Ancient kings the world over knew this was not a good situation. Not because they were kind-hearted, but they knew politically for themselves this was not a good situation. People who can't put dinner on the table for their family are not going to want to fight my wars. People who can't put dinner on the table are not going to want to pay me taxes. People who can't put dinner on the table are likely to rebel and find a new order that will enable them to be economically secure.
Poverty is not a good way to run the country.
Poverty, kings never, the smart kings know too much poverty is bad. The populace is going to be restive, not good. So what kings did the world over, it's remarkable, it was the same solution the world over, and that was when a new king would come to power, he would declare cancellation of debts. In fact, this is actually the root of the modern words in Greek, the modern words amnesty and philanthropy. You know, we have their modern meanings today of clemency or maybe of charity, but in the original Greek, those two words meant cancellation of debt. That's where they come from. Now, what the Torah says is, well, that's good to give people a new start, but that system still makes cancellation of debt a political football that helps the king become more powerful, because then the people will clap, oh, what a great king, he canceled our debt. Oh, and he also weakened the tycoons who had been owed the money, who might have been a threat to him. So really, cancellation of debt in that way, when a new king would come to power, was a real boon for the king. The Torah says, we can't wait around for who knows when there's going to be a new king? How is someone supposed to plan their life? And so in Deuteronomy 15, what the Torah says is, we're going to have it on a regular schedule. Every 7 years, we're going to have cancellation of debt, and people will be able to get back up on their feet economically.
Yeah, and the authority actually is in the hands of the God who is giving this law, and not in the hands of the king.
Right. God wants the average Israelite to be economically secure.
Yeah, so it even doesn't matter who is the king if there is any king at all on the throne.
Right, it has nothing to do with the king, nothing to do with whatever with the king. And there are other laws as well that we can see how they contribute to creating an economic safety net. For example, interest-free loans, which didn't exist anywhere else. In the Code of Hammurabi, loans get an interest of 33% per annum. That's good if you're giving the loan, really murderous if you have to pay back such a loan. Taxation, very interesting. The Torah says the taxation is fixed, 10% of what you manage to bring in. If you don't bring anything in, you don't have to pay any tax. And if you bring in a lot, then you only still have to pay 10%. But elsewhere, everybody had to pay tax whether they were earning money or not. And in Egypt, for example, when there was a very, very bountiful year because of the inundation of the Nile, the tax rate would also go up exponentially as well. And so what we see is that the Torah wants people to hold on to most of the produce. Only a little bit of the produce goes to the temple.
In your book, you wrote something very interesting which attracted my attention, that even the Jewish calendar, the Israelite calendar, which is described in the Torah, is in fact related to the economic agenda.
Yeah. So let's talk about calendars. Every culture has to have a calendar. You have to measure time. What's fascinating is that when we look at ancient calendars, we see that what we have in the Torah is quite different. Elsewhere, time is measured in 3 units: years, months, and days. What's missing from that in terms of our contemporary measurements? The week, right? The week. There is no notion of a week anywhere in the ancient world. It's not an accident either, because when you think, well, years, months, and days, What do those have in common? What they have in common is that they all measure astronomic activity, right? The revolutions of the sun and the moon. Obviously the day, we see the sun rise and set, and we see the moon, it's full, and then it disappears, it comes back. But even the sun with regard to a year. I know, for example, in my synagogue, where I go every Saturday for services, I know that from the 12th of May until the 5th of August, I have to come to synagogue Saturday morning with my sunglasses on because the sunlight is coming in through the window of the synagogue exactly on my seat. And I know that the sun comes back to the same place vis-a-vis a particular point on the earth once a year. And I think that the ancients knew this even without going to synagogue. They knew that the sun returns to the same point vis-a-vis a position on the earth on an annual basis. So it's not surprising to us that ancient calendars were based on astronomic activity of the sun and the moon, days, months, and years. What is this week? The week is totally artificial in that nothing divides by 7. The year doesn't divide by 7. The month doesn't divide by 7. 7 is a contrivance, if you will. And obviously 7 comes from the 7 days of creation. Okay? Now it's obvious, you can say, well, that's great. The Torah made us a week. Without a week, we couldn't have a weekend. And that's true. But what I want to emphasize here is that we see that this idea of a 7th unit of time, in the case of the week, the Sabbath, where all economic activity ceases. And similar to that, what we call the sabbatical year, that after 6 years of working the land, the 7th year the land shall lie fallow. And that after 7 cycles of sabbatical year, we have the 50th year, the Jubilee year, which also economic activity ceases. There's enormous implication of this. And what the Torah really emphasizes about Sabbath or sabbatical year is not to remember creation, but what it says is to allow everybody to rest as you rest. Let me explain what the significance of this is. Let's think of our own times. Let's think of our own economic activity. Isn't it shocking? Think about this for a second. You meet someone for the first time, and almost inevitably, the first question you ask them is, what do you do? That's really interesting. The first question that I want to know about somebody is their profession. You might have said, what do you enjoy in your leisure time? What are your values? What good deeds do you do? But almost inevitably, the first thing we ask someone is, what do you do? We want to understand where does this person...
To classify you.
Yeah, to classify you economically, socioeconomically. And when we do that, inevitably, some people have a better answer than others. Some people are really, really good at making money. And some of us are professors. I do okay, thank God. But, we're all, I think, keenly aware that there are those that are very successful, those that are somewhat successful, those that are kind of scraping to get by, and those that aren't getting by.
And professors.
The professors are doing fine. Now, and this kind of creates tensions, I think, between classes, between people. Am I worth it? Am I not worth it? What the Torah says is that 1 day a week, economic activity will cease. 1 year out of 7, we will not work the lands. Put differently, we are mandated to encounter one another on a new axis. On Saturday, I cannot ask you, what do you do? Or I can, but it's not relevant to what happens on a Saturday. On this day, or in the 7th year, we are commanded to encounter one another as members of the covenant. What is our connection to one another? What is happening in our polity, in our country? How are we relating to God? It's liberating because it means that even though our identity as economic beings is important, the Torah does not believe in a communist order. It believes that it is important to incentivize productivity 6 days a week, but we cannot be only and exclusively economic beings. There are times when we have to put the brakes on the economic activity so as to free up a space in time to re-encounter one another as spiritual beings, as social beings. That is the primary contribution, I think, of the Torah's calendar in creating a week and of creating the sabbatical cycle and the Jubilee at the end of that. I recall I recall during the financial meltdown in 2008, I arrived in New York. I landed at Kennedy Airport, and I rented a car. And as soon as I came out of the airport, there was an enormous billboard that said the following. It said, Financial Crisis 101. Self-worth is worth more than net worth. Very pithy, very pithy. And I'm sure a lot of drivers are like, yeah, that's right, that's right. And maybe all of us believe that, but it's kind of hard to really believe that, because when everyone is always saying to you, so what do you do? Oh, and how big is your house? Etc., etc., then it's really hard to internalize your self-worth, which obviously is made up of many, many more things than how much money you're making. And the Torah tries to create an environment where that question of what is my self-worth can really be appreciated and is independent from the question of what is my net worth.
Professor Berman, in fact, all your book is based on the text which is written in the Bible, Tanakh. But can we have some understanding whether was this the real historic reality, or it was more wishful thinking expressed in the text?
Right. So I think we can clearly say that the Torah is written as an aspirational document. This is what society should look like. To what degree did it actually look that way? I'll cite here some very interesting observations by my Bar-Ilan University colleague, Professor Avraham Faust. He's an archaeologist here in Israel, and he noticed some very interesting things about the villages of Judah and of Israel from the time of the First Temple period. He noted the following. He said, everywhere else that we dig in the ancient Near East, you can always see the telltale signs of hierarchy and stratification. They come in two spheres. The first is burial. When you go to the cemetery or to the burial cave, is there a more elaborate burial, a sarcophagus, or are people just, buried without anything? You can always see who are the upper class and who are the lower class. But in Israel, in Judah and in Israel, all the villages that we know, we find the burial caves, but we're never able to see any distinction between haves and have-nots. And that suggests a kind of egalitarian ethos. The other area that he sees this in his work, the other telltale sign, is what type of earthenware are people eating from? In all other cultures, you can clearly see there are those that are eating from the most simple type of earthenware, and then there are those that have decorated earthenware, and those are the more wealthy ones. But in the villages of Judah and Israel, you never see a distinction. The clay, the ceramic is all the same. And all of this together contributes to the notion that there must have been a kind of egalitarian ethos that discouraged, highlighting these differences. And so it's so interesting that what Professor Faust observes coming from the ground matches what I see coming from the text.
Another very interesting topic which you mentioned in your book is the, in fact, technology, or I would say widespread of the skills, writing and reading skills, how it's related to all this economics and political.
Right. Okay. Let me explain. We see a real revolution in biblical times in what I would call technology of communication. Let me explain what I mean by that from an example I think that we're all somewhat familiar with. All of us are familiar that prior to the invention of the computer, maybe the most important invention of the last 1,000 years was the printing press in the 15th century. What's fascinating about the history of the printing press, the history of its reception, who used it and when and where, is a fascinating question. We see the following thing, that in Western Europe it was used widely and right away. And in Eastern Europe it was used much less. And in the Muslim world, almost not at all. Even though the basic machine itself, the printing press, is not a particularly difficult or complicated machine to build. So why was there this difference? It is because in order for the printing press to be adopted fully, a culture has to be willing to empower the common masses. When you start having printing presses and they're churning out Bibles and they're churning out newspapers and they're churning out all sorts of publications like Luther's proclamations, etc., then you have to be ready to teach people to read and write, and that gives them power. Now, in Western Europe, the printing press happened to come along at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation said, we want to make each person, they should be their own priest, and they should have their own encounter with the Bible. And so, hallelujah, we're able to now put a Bible in every home, because Bibles now don't require a copyist to write down. You just churn them out on the printing press and teach people to read. Well, how long does it take to learn to read? Not so long. And so they were all in, gung-ho, on teaching people to read and write, which then, of course, inevitably leads to education and leads to stimulation of ideas. And this is how we get Western Europe being the economic powerhouse that it is today. In Eastern Europe, they were far more hesitant. The Protestant Reformation didn't succeed there so much. There was much more suspicion. What do you mean? You give the people the Bibles? What are they going to understand? They're just simpletons. They don't know how to interpret the Bible. People should come to church and they can look at the stained glass windows and get inspiration from the pictures that are there, and that's enough for the people. But we need to have priests who will safeguard all of this sacred knowledge. And so in Eastern Europe, where the printing press was not adopted because there wasn't an underlying culture ready to empower the common people, we see even to this day that the economy of Eastern Europe lags behind Western Europe. And in the Muslim world, the sheikhs understood this. They understood, whoa, printing press, that means literacy, that means power. We want the power. And so the printing press, to use one, was a sin. And to this day, the economies of the Muslim world, of the Arabic-speaking world, are if you take out oil and things like that, then the total GDP is that of Spain, which in itself is not such a mighty economic power. Now, what is all this? That's all very interesting. What does it have to do with Bible and the biblical period? Well, we have a similar development in the period of the Bible, and that is the alphabet. Now, even though it is often said that the Jewish people, the people of the book, we didn't invent the alphabet, that's for sure. But ancient Israel adopted the alphabet and ran with it in a way that was unprecedented. The alphabet was probably founded to a large degree by peasants in Egypt, maybe by scribes in Phoenicia, maybe simultaneously, both together. But initially, certainly the scribes in Phoenicia who were working with the alphabet, they were still using it for the same old purposes, which was to keep records for the kings, to keep records for the temples. Okay? But inherent in the alphabet is the capacity to share ideas widely, to share narratives widely. The Bible is the Old Testament is the first document in history that is written for wide distribution. And its laws and its stories are written for the people. Nothing like that had ever existed. There is no national history of any culture that precedes that. Nothing, not even in an oral way, let alone written down. So this idea of, no, we want people to know how to read and write. It really begins with the Old Testament. Now, the truth is that even in biblical times, probably most people did not know how to read and write. Isaiah speaks about how there are people who know how to read and write and they don't listen to me. So we know that there were some. But what's fascinating is that you don't have to know how to read in order to have access to a text. That's unintuitive. Let me explain what I mean by that. Today we would think, who has access to a text? If you know how to read, then you have access. If you don't know how to read, how are you going to have access to the text? It works like this. In pre-modern times, you would have maybe one person who was literate, and he would stand before the community and read out the texts. And in this way, if there's even one person in the community who is literate, then he can share the prophecies and the narratives and the stories together with the entire people.
Yeah, by reading it out.
By reading it out loud, yeah. In fact, the Hebrew word for reading, likro, is the same word as calling out, likro. Reading and calling out. We would think reading and calling out, those are two separate things. They are polar opposites. If you're in a library like we are, you have to read. Shh. You can't call out. How can reading and calling out? Because reading and calling out were the same thing in ancient times. Much reading was done for an entire community.
Wow, Professor Berman, it was really a very non-usual approach to the Bible, and I think very important one. Could you ramp up this conversation?
Yeah, so what we see here is that even though we think about the Bible as a religious text, we have to expand what we mean by a religious text. A religious text needs to speak about all facets of society, including its social and political ones. And what we see is that the Torah is giving us a blueprint for a society that is revolutionary, in that it dilutes hierarchy and stratification in the political realm, in the economic realm, in the theological realm, and even with regard to technologies of communication. Those that want to read a little more about this might be interested in my book, Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, published by Oxford University Press in 2008. All of this is expanded upon here in this book. And so I want to thank you, Alex. It was a delight to be with you.
Professor Joshua Berman, thank you very much for being with us. And guys, stay tuned on Kedem channel for more. Like, subscribe, share. And again, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.